Before we jump into talking about this week's movie in particular, I want us to get a sense of where it fits in the history of horror. This week, looking at the 1930s, we are in what some would call the golden age of horror. Although there are certainly film historians who reject the idea of any of the periods of horror being a golden age. But this is where we get the classic ideas of what Dracula looks like and what the Frankenstein monster looks like, the Halloween costume monsters of my youth anyway. I don't know if kids still dress up as Dracula or Frankenstein or the Wolfman or the Mummy, but when I was a kid we did. The universal horror monsters were seemingly ubiquitous. Books at the library, books at sometimes the convenience store, or I remember buying a book that was like a picture book on horror that was a survey, and all these black and white images from the classic Universal years. Picked that up at a co-op, it's like a Safeway, and these were the monsters of the 1930s, and it all began with the Todd Browning version of Dracula, which was based on a very successful stage adaptation of Dracula, and in no way owing any debt to Nosferatu, which to some degree had gone underground and been largely forgotten already by this point. The same year, because of the huge success of Dracula, Universal Pictures released Frankenstein, the movie that is the precursor to the film that we're going to watch, or we're going to talk about today, starring Boris Karloff, but you wouldn't have known from the opening credits. He's not credited in the opening credits of the original film. It wasn't that they were like trying to hide who was playing the monster. They just trying to, sort of create some mystique about it. But Karloff's name was clearly already synonymous with horror, and we can start using that term at this point. That's something else that we should know, that the idea that Nosferatu is proto-horror, that we can't really consider the German expressionist films as horror because there wasn't a term for it, there wasn't a genre to slot it in. By this point, there was a genre, and Universal was building that genre. They were the studio to compete with if you wanted to be doing horror movies, and we'll want to talk about studio pictures at some point today. But they followed up, Dracula and Frankenstein in the same year. The following year, Karloff played the Mummy. And then we got The Invisible Man in 1932. And you can see Carl Laemmle's name on each of these films. And Carl Laemmle was an entrepreneur, really, who looked at what was going on in early film, where you would pay a nickel and you would go into a Nickelodeon, that's what they called them, and you would look through a viewfinder and you could watch a movie by yourself, one person at a time. And Laemmle was one of the people who recognized that if there was a way that you could project this film, you could get a lot more butts and seats and you could make a ton more money. And he did, and he formed Universal Studios. And his son was running the company by the time we get to 1935 and The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, we should know just a little bit about the studio approach to making films. The studio era of movies is this time when you have companies like Universal Studios, and they have a roster of directors. The people who own the studio are often the producers. Carl Laemmle's name is on the poster for Bride of Frankenstein, but he wasn't actively involved in the film side of the business by this point. He was starting to leave that to his son, and so we get an obvious production credit for Carl Laemmle Jr., whereas his father was the man who had built the company. and Junior was running it by this point. Well, Laemmle was actually engaged in the years that followed 1935 in getting Jews out of his home city, and he rescued something like 300 people. And that's he was dumping funds from Universal Pictures into that. So it's a sort of interesting little aside, and I think a fascinating piece of history that is terribly relevant to some of the meanings that surround the Bride of Frankenstein, readings of the Bride of Frankenstein. The Bride of Frankenstein was considered a sequel by everyone but the man who made it, and we also need to know a little bit about where things had gone, not only with the studio system, but the production code. And that features directly into how this sequel, not sequel, begins. We see at the beginning this picture approved by the Production Code Administration of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. The Production Code, also called the Hays Code, by one of the people who had suggested that it come into effect, began being talked about in the early 30s, 1930. But it wasn't until 1934 that they really brought a lot of the rules and regulations into play. And this was an industry standard that if you wanted to make a motion picture that was going to be distributed by normal means, you had to adhere to. And it was a way of clamping down on sort of the Hollywood Babylon of the 1920s. Things had gotten out of control, not only on screen, but off screen. But that's a whole nother story. What we need to know is that the Production Code Administration was about censorship. It was about restraint. And there are those who would say that it is this restraint that drove creative minds like James Whale, the director of The Bride of Frankenstein, to greater creative heights. That if they'd just been allowed to do whatever they wanted, we wouldn't have gotten what we get with The Bride of Frankenstein, which many horror aficionados and even, we might just say straight up film historians, think is one of the greatest either horror films of all time or just greatest films of all time. There are film historians who would put it on the same level as Citizen Kane. So it's considered one of the greats, and some of those film historians think it's the Production Code Administration that pushed creative minds like James Whale to make great films because they had to find other ways to say things than just saying them. That censorship produced greater creativity. Here we, early in the film, with over the credits, Carl Laemmle presents Karloff. Within just a few years, just 5 years, Boris Karloff, unnamed in the original opening credits to Frankenstein, is now the name that gets the butts in seats. And he doesn't even need a first name. He's just Karloff, right? Incidentally, in case you didn't know, Boris Karloff would go on not only to star in many great movies and some bad ones as well, but he's also the voice of the Grinch in the original cartoon version of the Dr. Seuss Christmas classic. A great choice, I think, for a Grinch. I think recent Grinch films can maybe take a page out of the producers of that cartoons book and go find someone who's worked a lot in horror. Get the voice of a monster to be your Grinch, not the voice of a comedian or a respected thespian. Who was James Whale? James Whale was the man who had directed the original Frankenstein. He had tried to direct a bunch of other pictures. Well, he had directed a bunch of other pictures. When I use tried, his other films hadn't been terribly successful. And so he was forced to come back to horror, as he put it, to fantasy. And it really wasn't what he wanted to do, but Carl Laemmle Jr. was able to get him on board with Bride of Frankenstein by offering him the gig of directing a movie called Showboat, which was based on a great, very, very popular Broadway play. Incidentally, Showboat is the film that more or less sunk the Laemmles. They put something like 3/5 of their yearly budget into producing Showboat and had to go to go to a loaning somebody. They had to go to somebody else. I don't want to get into the details of who that is, but those people took over. They took over Universal. The Laemmles were out after Showboat. And so Bride of Frankenstein is one of the last films that the Laemmles were actively involved in creating for Universal Studios. But James Whale didn't want to be on board. He did not want to make a sequel to Bride of Frankenstein, and didn't really consider the movie a sequel per se. He considered it something else. He considered it his way of taking horror, which had become hugely popular. It was an excuse to print money, as they say, and he wanted to do something new with it. He was innovative, and was interested in doing something that had never really been seen before, which we can maybe class as one of the first great horror comedies. The movie opens, unlike its original, with a frame narrative. And this frame narrative is one of the things that not so much the production code was responsible for, but there were some Catholic priests in Los Angeles who apparently suggested that the original Frankenstein could benefit from a prologue. They thought that'll tone down the horror, because if it's just made up. This is the thing about frame narratives, right? If you have somebody telling the story, or, in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, it's just a dream, because in Baum's book, it wasn't just a dream. It really happened to the Dorothy of Baum's imagination, the original Wizard of Oz as text. But in the film, they wanted to tone down the fantasy, because fantasy apparently wasn't popular, and yet at the same time, Bride of Frankenstein, hugely popular. And these other horror films, which could be classified as dark fantasy at the very least, doing successful trade. But there are a number of film historians who seem to think that James Whale felt like, okay, this time around, let's use that. Let's use that frame narrative wherein we've got Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley, and of course Mary Shelley, played by Elsa Lanchester, who would also play the bride at the end of the film. So there's this dark doubling, as Anne Marie Adams calls it, this dark doubling in this film. And this was something that was planned early on. They had considered a number of actresses for the role of the bride, but then realized, most of these actresses are just faces. They are physical presences. They're not actors. And so instead they went with Elsa Lanchester, who had the chops to be able to do the opening sequence. And as we'll see, the chops to be the bride. So we get this opening sequence. We see Minnie here for just a very brief moment, walking the dogs out of the shot. And so there's a little bit of that Oz thing going on here, where we have these doubles. They show up here at the beginning, they show up later in the film. The other actors in this sequence do not show up later in the film, but it allows for a Last Time on Frankenstein montage of footage from the original film, some footage that was cut even, and it allows for a review for those who wouldn't know the story. I don't know who those people would have been in 1935, because Frankenstein had been such a hugely successful film. That's why they made Bride. They were, the Universal Studios was finding that all these other monster pictures were doing all right, but they weren't doing the same kind of traffic that a return to the hyper-successful Frankenstein might achieve. And so that was what drove the sequel. But we get this Last Time On montage catching us up in terms of story, so that we're ready when Elsa Lanchester as Mary Shelley says, it didn't end with the monster dying. It didn't end with the death of his creator. No. Let me tell you the rest of the story. And so what we get at the beginning of this film, and this is a quote from Alberto Manguel, who wrote the BFI Film Classics book on Bride of Frankenstein. He says it is this film is then within the diegesis, the universe, the fictional universe of the movie, explicitly Mary Shelley's story. That doesn't mean that it is fidelitous to the actual Mary Shelley's story, but rather it is the story being told by the Mary Shelley of the diegesis of this film. So Manguel says it is explicitly Mary Shelley's story, an imagination or a nightmare, a forbidden version of the author herself, which is, I think, a really, really interesting way of reading this movie, that we are reading not the first film, where there was this sense in which it had really happened somehow. It's fascinating to me that anybody would ever think that a frame narrative would downplay the level of fantasy that a film produces, but at the same time, I think we all experience the hyper-realism of film because it captures real things, as it were. Right? We capture real actors and real sets and, real fire in this movie. So those realities challenge our sense of being able to step away from our suspension of disbelief, that we are so caught up in the fictional world, the diegesis of the film, that sometimes we can forget that it's only a story, that it's just a fiction. So we get this frame narrative that is only at the beginning of the film. We don't get the frame at the end, so it doesn't perfectly frame the movie. And that has a lot to do with what Whale wanted to do with the ending of the film. He wanted it to lack resolution. When he went to talk to Waxman, the composer of the film's music, he said, "I want you to compose me some music that does not resolve." So even the soundtrack was supposed to lack resolution, so we would not come back around to this frame narrative at the end. So Shelley jumps us to the ending of Frankenstein with the, I think, somewhat iconic image of the burning windmill, which Tim Burton would reify with the imagery in his 1990s horror film Sleepy Hollow. But we find out that the monster's not dead, didn't burn in the mill, he fell down underneath into this grotto basement filled with water. I love the emergence of the monster. When I was watching this film and trying to imagine how it could have been horrifying to original audiences, the monster's hand coming out of that dark, shadowy little crevasse, a little crack off to the side, emerging from those shadows, looking worse for wear. His hair's been burned away, but Karloff looking diabolical enough to certainly horrify viewers in 1935. And still, if we are being the sympathetic viewers that I talked about in the last lecture, to give us a sense of disquiet as we see the monster for the first time. The monster murders the parents of the little girl that he inadvertently killed in the first film. Throws this girl into a lake and drowns her, a scene that was excised from a number of prints of the film because it was considered too horrifying for the viewers at the time. And yet the film references that, and the production code, the keeper of the production code, Joseph Breen, did not ask for that to be removed. There was a ton of other things Joseph Breen asked for the removal of. James Whale just filmed every death that he could and said, let Joseph Breen sort it out. And Joseph Breen did. The original film would have had 21 deaths. And what we get in the finished, 21 on-screen deaths. What we get in the finished film are 10 confirmed on-screen deaths. So we can see the results of that. But Whale went for every possible death that he could. And the film really begins on a dark tone in killing the parents of the little girl that the monster inadvertently killed in the first film. Like, he didn't really mean to kill her, but, you kill a little girl. That's like one of those, serious taboos, killing kids. Serious taboos. Frankenstein did it. And then in the second movie, just as, hold my drink, the movie begins by killing those parents off. It's as though it's saying right off the bat, just so you know, we still mean business. And that's probably good, given where the movie goes next in delivering its blend of melodrama, horror melodrama, with comedy. The camp comedy that runs throughout this film in several of the performances, but also in some of the way that the scenes are staged. And this is one of those great moments where we've just seen the monster kill two people, and then he comes up behind the actress Una O'Connor playing the what is she Minnie, like she's everywhere. She's like a Greek chorus of one. And she had played the housekeeper in The Invisible Man, and she's doing some of the same shtick in this movie. So she turns around and looks up, and it's great. It's just great, great physical moment for Karloff looming over her, and then she goes into this comedic scream, helping us to see that this is not the film that viewers saw last time. There was a number of film historians who recognized that Whale knew that in the 5 years since the huge success of the original Frankenstein, that there's huge level of expectation. So he didn't give the audience everything they wanted. He gave them a number of things that they wanted, but he made something new, something that that wasn't just a sequel, but was its own film. And Una O'Connor, I absolutely love her. I know that this is like one of those love-hate performances, but Una O'Connor as Minnie kills me. I think she's absolutely hilarious, and I laughed out loud when she discovers that Dr. Frankenstein is not dead, but rather, he's just unconscious. When she yells, "He's alive! Alive!" she's echoing Colin Clive's famous line from the original Frankenstein movie. And Colin Clive's going to say it too, but you can imagine that this is one of those catchphrases. Like in the 80s, we were all saying, "I'll be back," off of the, Terminator film. And then we did it again when the second movie was released. And you get these catchphrases from films, from TV. And at the time, it's clear that this had become a bit of a catchphrase. It's alive, alive, and it's been used in. It was used in the film Weird Science, the 1980s movie Weird Science, referencing Bride of Frankenstein in so many ways. But I love Una O'Connor's performance. I think she's great. And then now that we know that Dr. Frankenstein's not really dead, we get to hear him say, "Oh, I really shouldn't have done that thing that I did back in the first movie," as he talks to his bride, his actual Bride of Frankenstein, and he's like, "No, I'm not going to do this anymore." But he won't get to stick with that for very long, because in rolls Dr. Pretorius. Now, if we have to pick a monster for this movie, we get to choose from three. And obviously we've got the Frankenstein monster. Clearly we've got the bride at the end. We have to wait an awful long time for her, but she's still there. But I think Pretorius is the true monster of this film. Mad scientists were all the rage. Even that year there was a film that had been released called Mad Love. And there was a glut of mad scientists, and Pretorius is one more along the way, but he's played with such aplomb by Ernest Essinger, who was really an unknown at this point, but he would go on to become a known commodity in film, period film in particular. But he just eats up the set. He very nearly steals the show from Karloff. In fact, I would go so far as to say that he does. Though I don't think that's Karloff's fault. I think that's the fault of Whale and the other screenwriter. Well, there were several screenwriters. There are 8 writers on this film, but it's William Hurlbut and James Whale who produced the script that the film was made from. And having the monster speak, I think, is one of the things that reduces Karloff's efficacy in this film. But Ernest Essinger as the, we might say, Mephistophelian Dr. Pretorius. And I love Una O'Connor. Pretorius? When she first hears his name, she has to say it over and over again for comedic effect. Alberto Manguel makes a great deal about how, you have to name the devil a bunch of times before he'll appear. I just think they had Una O'Connor say it over and over again because it's funny. And also to make sure that everybody in the audience would have it, because Pretorius is a great Latin name, but not just doesn't roll off your tongue like Bob. So it gets said over and over again, but Pretorius as this Faustian figure, this Faustian devil who comes to Frankenstein with an offer. We should work together. He was Frankenstein's mentor, and now he says we should work together. And the shots of Ernest Essinger as Pretorius are textbook, and I'm not even using that as a sort of like, ooh, they're textbook moments of horror lighting, but they are. And I say that, that it's not just me making it as some sort of cliche, because the textbook that I use for introductory film, looking at movies by Richard Barsom and Dave Monahan, includes a shot of Thesiger as Pretorius in the section of the book on lighting, saying this is what horror lighting looks like. One of the shots from the end of the film when they're bringing the bride to life. Just these wonderful shots, and he is so invested in his performance, and it's a little bit funny and it's a little bit horrifying. So there are moments where you laugh because he does this wonderfully flamboyant Pretorius, but there are other moments where you're like, gosh, that's awfully dark, given what his goals are. Meanwhile, back in the woods, the Frankenstein monster has scared a shepherdess. She nearly drowns. He saves her, so there's a reversal of what he did in the first film. He realizes, I guess, that if you stay in water too long, you die. And he rescues her, but she's horrified by him, and then some hunters come along and they shoot at him, and so humans hate me, and he runs off, and he gets to this hill, and I don't think it's any accident that we've got this really cinematic looking crag. We might call it a Golgotha, because this film is absolutely rampant with Christian imagery, and not in a let's do the monster as Christ figure, even though once the villagers capture him, we get a sort of crucifixion. But we don't want to just jump to, well, he's a Christ figure. He's an inverted Christ figure. And this is something that Scott McQueen, film historian, talks about in the commentary for the Blu-ray version of Bride of Frankenstein. He says, we don't just have a slamming of the church here. We have an inversion of one of the foundational myths of Western society, wherein we get a resurrection and then a crucifixion, right? The monster is resurrected in the first film. He's crucified and vilified in the second in ways that echo Christ's crucifixion. So he's up on a hill, and then they grab the cross of sorts, right? They put him on this beam, and then they take him away to imprison him. So there's this reversal going on. But the Christian imagery is throughout. Monster breaks loose, goes on a killing spree, absolute rampage, killing one, and he doesn't discriminate in his killing. He kills young people, old people. He's inclusive, we might say, with his rampage of murder. And so it's an interesting movie in the way that it keeps switching back and forth between these tones, because we get moments again with Una O'Connor in that entire sequence where she's in and amongst all the villagers. You wonder, like, did she get the day off from the work that she's been doing up at Frankenstein's castle, and she just gets to run off, and she's not the maid now, but was she in town picking up bagels? I don't know. But she's everywhere, and that's why I think she's sort of a mirror the audience character in some ways. But Frankenstein escapes, goes on his rampage, ends up at a cottage in the woods, tranquil cottage in the woods, where he meets an old blind man. And again, we get this reiteration of Christian imagery, again, inverted, twisted, messed with. James Whale was not a friend of the church. James Whale was gay, and there are a lot of readings of this film that are queer, and I think they at least the ones I've read, tend to hold up really well. So a queer reading of this film responds well, given that Whale seems to be injecting it with his own views on just about everything, but in this case, religion and relationship, because the monster and this blind man who cannot see his monstrosity, his disfigurement, are going to become friends, right? We get this word friend over and over again. And I couldn't help but think, and I didn't have time to look into the etymology of this, but I'm interested in Whale as British director, perhaps thinking about the synonym of mate and friend, right? Like we have the word mate for someone that you are bound to for the rest of your life through marriage. So the bride is ostensibly Frankenstein's mate. But what about the way in which British slang says, me and my mates were hanging out? And so is there a way in which the friend here is a mate, as friend, but also as partner, coming out of Wales' homosexuality? I don't want to read these things as though it's like this then tells us that this is this about this film, because like Alberto Menguel, I can't find a single concept that totalizes that we can allegorize this film with. There are moments where you can go, oh, that maybe we could read it like this, and yeah, you can. But the movie resists a totalizing viewpoint. It's like reading Kafka's Metamorphosis. If you go in and you go, oh, well, this is clearly about, the allegory falls apart at some point. Same thing with Bride of Frankenstein. These ideas hold for certain sequences and certain scenes, but they aren't kept consistent throughout the film. And I don't think that's a messy thing. I think that's a subtext thing. I think this film certainly works at the level of subtext. When we do these sorts of readings for meaning, this is a film that is all about subtext, because the plot works as plot. Like, this movie rolls along and then this happens, and it's exciting just for that. But we can't ignore that this old man, going back to the religious imagery of the film, where we get the bread and the wine, right? He holds up the bread, and it's like he's serving communion, or the Eucharist. And he breaks the bread, and the monster eats it in this, over the top gusto, and then wine, and he chugs it. Neither of those are the ways that you would receive communion. And then it's like the bread, the wine, and it feels there's this sense of and presence, and Waxman's score is it has these religious motifs in it, and the organ is playing in the background at one point. The editor highlights the crucifix on the wall in the fade out, and then it's like bread, wine, and a cigar, and right there that's the punchline. And people have made a great deal about, oh, the smoking is this moment of friendship, and I'm like, it's the punchline. It's the punchline to a joke. Bread, wine, and a cigar. Like, I keep waiting for Karl, I was going to say Karl Marx. I'm waiting for Karl Marx to come out and talk about socialism. I'm waiting for Groucho Marx to, jump out of the back of the picture at that point. More of that subtle humor that runs throughout the film. The monster's relationship, though, with the old man is abhorrent. Clearly, that's one of those queer readings that said, these two men are not allowed to live together. The hunters come in, and they're like, that's the monster, and they drive him away. Again, repetitions of religious iconography throughout this sequence. When the monster first steps out of the blind man's hut, there is a crucifix right next to where he's standing, or sorry, when he comes upon these children, there's a crucifix right off to the side, and then when he gets into the cemetery and runs through, there's a repetition of religious imagery, the angel, the whatever saint it is that he knocks over. The original script called for him to actually grapple with a crucifix, and the ratings board was like, no, the production code was like, no, you can't. Joseph Breen said, there's enough blasphemy in this film as it is. That was their big problem, was they were like, there's all this blasphemy, but the things that they cut retain so much of Whale's blasphemy that I think he's a very clever filmmaker, sneaking in under what most people would be watching for. Something I want to talk about just at this point as we move through the film is how gorgeous some of the cinematography is. The work that cinematographer John Mescal did on this film is absolutely incredible. It's done with something called Rembrandt lighting, which creates these really hard contrasts, and we get to see that over and over again. But I think the graveyard sequence and then the catacombs that follow is one of the great moments, really wonderful examples of this being done, where the way that the lighting was pointed at the subjects created what Mescal said was an eerie, mysterious atmosphere, working with the light from really odd angles and filling the screen with dark shadows. Again, though, a film filled with contrasts. One moment it's eerie, mysterious atmosphere, and the next moment it's Pretorius partying with the skull of a young woman. And that's one of those moments where it's like, that's funny, and it's really disquieting, right? There's some really creepy necrophiliac stuff going on here with Pretorius's party on a coffin. And even just the fact that he goes down there and you think it's like, oh, he's going to rob the grave. But then he hangs around afterwards. Like, robbing the grave is sort of acceptable universal horror territory. But then having a smoke and drinking and laughing with the skull is a whole new macabre. In melodrama, we don't mind the crazy coincidence of Pretorius running into the monster and telling him, oh, hey, we're making you a bride, making all sorts of new Faustian bargains, not only with the creator, but the created. And again, a little bit of humor. I'll come back to what I'd mentioned earlier about Karloff's speaking in this film. I think his performance is still fantastic, but there were all these compromises that they had to make to allow him to speak in the film. For starters, he had a dental plate that he could take out, and that was what made his face look so cadaverous in the first film. He had to have that in to say anything intelligibly, and so his cheeks are more filled out. So he's a healthier monster this time around. But Karloff himself was convinced that having the monster speak would reduce it in some way, and I can't help but agree. Me personally, the speaking moments of the monster don't really work, and I'm in agreement with a number of film historians who say Karloff's performance is so great physically, we don't really need him to say bread or friend, any of these things. Although the repetition of that word friend, as I've said before, I think is an interesting thing to run down, that the monster seeks friendship. The monster, like Adam in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Genesis, saying, there's nobody like me. There's all these animals, but they're not like me. I want somebody who's like me. And so the monster is another twisted icon of Western religious imagery. So Pretorius and the monster are now in cahoots. The monster goes to he shows up at Frankenstein's along with Pretorius, and they say, hey, let's get to work on this. And Frankenstein's like, no, I won't do it. And Pretorius shows Frankenstein the monster, and that he's he has speech and he's under Pretorius's control. But the real leverage comes when the monster goes and kidnaps Frankenstein's wife, when he kidnaps Elizabeth. And this scene of the monster standing outside prefigures so many moments of the monster standing outside a window. From the revenant corpse that we have in The Bride of Frankenstein all the way up to the monsters of slasher films like Halloween. In this case, we are voyeurs of the voyeur. That's something that Alberto Manguel says at one point. We are voyeurs of the voyeur. But in John Carpenter's Halloween, we are in the camera view. We are in that point of view. In movies like Scream, we're getting a reiteration of this moment, but now rendered different just by the nature of the monster and the nature of the victim and what the monster is willing to do. In Bride of Frankenstein, the monster is willing to go in and steal Elizabeth away. In recent horror films, the monster comes in and just stabs you to death. Or in the Kenneth Branagh version of the Frankenstein story, the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, starring, lamentably, Robert De Niro as the monster, he just tears Elizabeth's heart out in a scene that mirrors this. but it prefigures a number of moments in horror that are yet to come, where a monster stands outside your window, and that's one of the scariest ones for me, by the way. That's one of my nightmares, is the monster at the window. I hate covered like blinds or whatever at night. I don't like opening them. I'm better at it now, but I mean, I'm in my 20s. I was often ridiculously terrified in the middle of the night by walking past windows, because I was always afraid something was going to jump up and look at me through them. I blame Salem's Lot and the film of the Twilight Zone. There's moments in both of those where there's something at the window. But now Frankenstein can't help but get involved, and he and Pretorius set to work with diligence to create the bride. And there's a lot of really great shots in the creation sequence that are echoes of that German expressionism. The way that the lighting is done, that Rembrandt lighting, we see that the influence of the expressionist filmmakers. Not just that, though, but the very camera angles. There's all these tilted camera angles throughout the sequence of creating the bride, that the world has gone askew, as it were, as we see Frankenstein. There's all this great cross-cutting back and forth between all these gadgets around Frankenstein's laboratory, and then Frankenstein himself, played by Colin Clive, who was a wreck of a man at this point, by the way. Like, the reason he looks so haggard is because, sadly, he was an alcoholic and had to be supported on the set, bodily supported. There are shots where there are people just off camera holding Colin Clive up. It's arguably why he is often sitting or sitting up in bed in his sequences, but the reason he looks so absolutely haggard in this movie is largely due to his alcoholism. But the great canted angles looking at Pretorius, and again, Ernest Essinger just leaning into it and playing up that mad scientist so very well. Wonderful, wonderful shadowed shots with the light coming up from below. Great Vista style shots or not Vista, but these wide angle shots with really extreme angles looking down or looking up are all echoes of that expressionist, that German expressionist influence in Hollywood. A lot of those filmmakers were either directly influenced by them, or they were those filmmakers, German filmmakers, having relocated to America to continue their work. I love this sequence. I absolutely love this sequence. Watching it and trying to capture stills for my slides was challenging, because the movie moves at a pretty slow pace for most of the film. But this sequence is just bam, 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 bam. And editor Ted Kent's montage for the creation sequence is phenomenal. This is great work. So even if we can't recognize Bride of Frankenstein as scary, we can at least recognize it for its technical brilliance of for its time, technical brilliance, even with those moments where like the dialogue doesn't line up, like there's somebody's voice but there's no, the dubbing is off. That didn't matter as much. It's about the visual. And then we get the bride awakening herself, and she was modeled on Nefertiti, Egyptian queen. And so her initial moment, she looks like the mummified monster. But once she is unwrapped and unveiled, Elsa Lanchester's wig is modeled on this, the idea of the Egyptian queen, as it were. And so she's got this sort of monstrous and yet beautiful aspect to her. As Anne-Marie Adams says in her article, "What's in a Frame?" in the authorizing presence in James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein, she says, we've got this yoking of beauty and monstrosity. And I have wanted to see Bride of Frankenstein since I was a kid, and just never have. I've seen the odd classic horror movie, but I chose Bride of Frankenstein because it appears on so many great horror lists, but also because it was the one I hadn't seen. I'd seen Frankenstein, but I'd never seen Bride. And I wondered, why is this movie so magnificent? Why is it so incredible? But I'd seen a ton of images of Elsa Lanchester as the bride, and so I didn't really expect to be surprised in any way. And I already know what she looks like. But it wasn't so much what she looked like as the way that John Mescal, the cinematographer, captured her on film with Whale's direction and Ted Kent's editing again. When we see her unveiled and the camera does all these, like, well, I say the camera, but there are all these cuts. And in some of the shots, there's this really great, crisp, hard lighting. And then in other cases, there's soft, diffuse lighting. In one shot, she has something stuffed into her cheeks to distort her features. And then we get those bird-like movements, these flashbulb style movements as Elsa Lanchester just moves her head around. But that is accentuated by the editing, by these cuts, that we get all these different angles and shots of the bride. And I found that so compelling, so captivating. On the one hand, simply because there's a sort of terrible beauty, the yoking of beauty and monstrosity that Anne-Marie Adams talks about. But there's also a way in which the editing and the camera angles convey something about this monster's presence. And even though Elsa Lanchester as the bride is only on screen for a few moments, there's this way in which these shots, this scene, this sequence, have haunted me since. And I can't quite make heads or tails of it. And I went to academic secondary sources, academic articles, asking, like, what do y'all think? Wanting to know what someone else might say about it. Coming back to Anne-Marie Adams, she says that Shelley's bland and lovely brow could imagine such horrors. So we go back to that frame narrative at the beginning, because she is part of such horror herself. She's the author of Frankenstein, after all. So this monster is an echo of the monstrosity within Shelley that she put on the page. And she contrasts the hyper-articulate author of the frame narrative versus this hissing creature here at the end of the film. And the hissing, by the way, just as a sort of little bit of film trivia, was Elsa Lanchester's idea. She was basing it on swans that she'd seen in the park. And, anyone who's ever faced a swan will know they're terrifying. But she's terrifying. There's this way in which she is beautiful and yet monstrous. Erin Hawley in The Bride and Her Afterlife, Female Frankenstein Monsters on Page and Screen, says that the bride problematizes cultural assumptions about what should be considered monstrous and beautiful. Problematizes cultural assumptions about what should be considered monstrous and beautiful. And we're looking at a time in American history where there are these shifts going on. Women have the vote. There is an emancipation of women going on, and yet at the same time there's still like repression happening, right? She says the movements are jerky and halting, like those of a marionette or an automaton. What do we make of all these things? Is she controlled by her creators? The monster. She's a mail order bride in a way. Those are not any of the sources. This is just me looking at this and going, she's a mail order bride. But Elizabeth Young in Here Comes the Bride, Wedding, Gender, and Race in Bride of Frankenstein talks about the social anxieties of gender, sexuality, and race that the film addresses. And she says that despite her secondary status as a creature of male fantasy, the bride betrays the fear that all female bodies are in fact unspeakably monstrous, and in this monstrosity, unspeakably powerful. And when she says that they're monstrous, she's not saying like that Whale was terrified of the female body. The world was terrified of the female body, or at least the people behind the production code were terrified of the female body, because you can't show Elsa Lanchester's cleavage at the beginning of this film was one of the cuts. So even though we do see her costume at various points, there was apparently, and a lot of film historians talk about it, so it's not me going like, well, let me focus in on this particular irrelevant detail. It was a shot that really highlighted her décolletage, and the production code said, no, we can't have that. And so there is a way in which society saw the female body as monstrous in some way at this point. And there's so many ways for us to read that. I'm speaking about these moments from these scholars more as a way of getting to where Alberto Manguel ends up at the end of his BFI Film Classics book. And he says, near the end of it, he says, "And yet what exactly is the meaning of the strange man-made bride, that modern Eve beyond its sexuality? Who is this monstrous version of the angelic Mary Shelley, this transformation of the delicate Elsa Lanchester?" Because this question is allied with the question that we are going to continue to look at throughout this series. This question, why this horror at this time and this place and this people? Like, what exactly is horrifying about the Bride of Frankenstein? Is it the monster? Again, Elizabeth Young has argued that the creature, the Frankenstein monster, is marked not only by an undifferentiated otherness, that he's the other, he's the outsider, but specifically by behavioral and visual codes associated with blackness. Young is convinced that Karloff's Frankenstein stands in as a black brute filled with this rampage rage. Blacks were often figured in films as criminal, as inferior, as subhuman. These are all things that Elizabeth Young talks about, and believes that Karloff's monster, as she puts it, may more fully emblematize the iconography of U.S. racism than any other film more openly mimetic could have in this era. And so she's saying that the monster, perhaps more than a film that would be directly about a black monster, and I'm putting that in air quotes, could have in that era. Or even if it was a sympathetic perspective, would that have necessarily been received? So is it the monster? Is it Ernest Essinger as Pretorius? This film isn't really about the usual mad scientist business. They have pretended to be God. I mean, they dally with that, but I don't really think that's what this film is about at the end of the day. I think this film is about the fears of change, the way in which the world was changing and becoming more open, and we continue to see the resonances of this type of fear even today. But I don't think that this film can be read in a totalizing way. I think it requires a sort of multifaceted approach. And Manguel mentions this at the end of his film classics, and he says, Whale's Bride is a work in search of significance and therefore inexhaustible. I don't know that I agree about inexhaustible, because at the end of the day, this movie isn't about baseball. So it's not like you can make this film mean anything. There's only so much of a horizon of expectation that any work, any narrative work, any literary work, any cinematic work can provide us. But I will agree that it is in search of significance. And I think it's that lack of resolution here at the end of the film, not narratively, because the film has a narrative resolution, but that Whale had meant for it not to. And there's this shot where we can see Colin Clive off to the side of the set when the laboratory is exploding, is falling in on itself after the monster has thrown this switch to destroy them all. Because the monster says, "Go ahead, you go and live," he says to his creator. And that ending was tacked on after the production code said, "Hey, I don't know about that ending. Everybody dies." That's how the original film ended. Everybody dies. And the early preview of the film, there was also a sort of, wow, we'd really like a happier ending. And so we do get that happy ending. We get a happy, heterosexual ending where Frankenstein and Elizabeth get to live happily ever after. But that was not Whale's intent. Whale's intent was to end the film with everyone dying, and we get a snippet where we can see that. Now, I like to just go from what ends up on the screen. What didn't get into the film isn't really something that we can argue too far with, but we know that Whale meant for there to be this lack of resolution about this film, and I have to think that he also meant for the meaning of this film to lack a full resolution, rather that it simply interrogates so many normal things, and it becomes a repository of how Whale viewed these things. But clearly, it struck a chord with American audiences and British audiences at the time. It was hugely successful. Not as successful as the original Frankenstein, but certainly more successful than any other Universal horror film had been to that day. And it continues to be praised as a great classic. And Neil Gaiman has this wonderful thing that he said about the film. He said, in reality, the monster and the bride live on. We've forgotten about Henry and Elizabeth. So Henry Frankenstein and Elizabeth have been forgotten. We don't really think about Colin Clive all that much, except for it's alive, alive. But we remember the monster and we remember the bride. Over and over again. Revisioned in children's books, in people, dressing up in the costumes. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the bride. But I think that the film also lives on, the monster and the bride live on because of these indeterminate questions that they provoke in us. And I think that is where the unease, and if we want to say the horror of this film really lies. Next week, we go into the 1940s, and we leave the past behind, literally moving out of the gothic horror of Nosferatu and the Bride of Frankenstein into the contemporary horror of the Cat People. We'll see you then.